The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Weiner, Program Manager of Education and Practice at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for today's ASPPH Presents webinar, The New Congress and the Missions of Academic Public Health. This webinar is part of the 2019 ASPPH Presents series, which has been designed as a service to CEIF-accredited ASPPH member schools and programs of public health. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section soon. All registrants will receive an email with a link to the posted recording and slides when they are available. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. A few housekeeping items of note. A PDF of today's slides is available for immediate download in the handout section of the GoToMeeting. And while all your lines have been muted, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the chat or question box. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. And I will now turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Michael Erickson, Dean of Georgia State University School of Public Health and Chair of the ASPPH Advocacy Committee.
Thank you, and good day to everyone. We're very pleased to have this webinar for the next hour, reviewing the changes in Washington and Congress and the implications for academic public health. Our plan is that we'll spend the first 45 minutes or so reviewing the environment and how it's changed, and wind up talking about what we can do as schools and programs. Just to look at the outline, we'll be talking about the makeup of the Congress and how that shifted, leadership in Congress and how that's changed, particularly in the House, relationships between the President and Congress, and some of the top agenda items that are relevant for us as schools and programs, and then we'll conclude with what we can do, and we'll reserve the last portion of the session for Q's and A's. Just an overview from ASPPH's perspective. We are the advocacy agenda today in Washington particularly, but also in states, has exploded, and with a focus on regulatory and policy legislative issues. We really endeavor to give a voice to the academic public health community and make sure that policies, to the extent possible, reflect our priorities and perspective. We're very active in with other partners that are engaged in the public health advocacy, and we have a very robust website with resources on it. We have on the website, which you can find here at the URL, and click on ASPPH Connect and an advocacy fact sheets. We have a listing of our activities and the letters that have been sent over the 2018 year, and you can see what we initiated ourselves versus which we joined coalitions. And as you can imagine, it's been basically an issue of setting priorities and where we devote our energy and interest to both best represent the interests of public health, academic public health. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark Dusky from the Cornerstone group, who will kick off talking about changes in Congress. So Mark?
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And before we get into the 116th Congress, which began on January 3rd, we want to pick up where the last Congress left off and talk a little bit about some unfinished business that is carrying over and is in the headlines. And in fact, the president will be giving an address to the nation tonight and to talk about the shutdown. I think everyone's well aware that while some appropriations bills have been enacted into law, others have not. And so those that have not, the federal fiscal year started on October 1st of 2018. And so the first quarter is, we've blown through that. And we had a series of continuing resolutions that kept the government going up until December 21st at midnight. And on December 22nd, there was no continuing resolution that continued. The Congress did pass one in the House. It did not pass the Senate or go to the president's desk. So at that point, that Saturday morning, the government officially shut down. And so we're in the third week of a shutdown, and we're not sure when the end is in sight. Of course, the bone of contention is the border wall. The president has asked for $5 billion thereabouts, and you maybe heard some offers that they're willing to settle for $2.5 billion. On this slide, we show that the upper end of the range might go as high as $70 billion when the full construction is estimated to be about $25 billion plus land acquisition, maintenance once the wall's up and running. So it's not just a $5 billion wall. The price tag, if you went down to a concrete wall or steel slats wall, is much higher. The Democrats have countered that there will therefore border security, which might involve technology and not just a physical wall. So that is what the Congress is fighting about right now with the White House. So this is a little summary of the bills that are done versus those that aren't. So the blue represents the bills that were enacted, and these were all done actually by October 1st. So the defense bill being by far the largest. Most of HHS was enacted by October 1st. A couple of stragglers in the operating divisions are the Indian Health Service is not done, so that is on a continuing resolution. That's funded in the Interior Appropriations Bill. And then the FDA is actually funded in the Agriculture Appropriations Bill. So those two operating divisions are not done. Also part of kind of a sister agency to CDC, ATSDR is also funded in the Interior Bill, and that is also on a continuing resolution. So we have basically 5 done and 7, of the 12 are not done. As of this week, the Democrats have a new strategy, which is to break out 4 of those and send them down one by one and stack them up on the Senate President's desk. Mitch McConnell will then have to call them up or not. And those would be the transportation bill, the Interior bill, the financial service bill, and the ag bill. So those bills are going to be voted on again this week and sent over to the Senate. We don't know if Senator McConnell will pick them up. What he said is he's not going to send bills to the president if the president's going to veto them. So when it was all one big package, including the wall, that stalled the package. Now the Democrats have a plan B strategy, was to break this apart and send them bills that are not controversial, that are not cut up in the wall. The wall funding is essentially in the Homeland Security bill, and that the Democrats are trying to isolate that bill and free up the other essentially legislative hostages. So let's turn to the 116th Congress now. We'll just go through some election results very quickly. So you can see the balance of power, of course, shifted, and the gallows passed from Republican-controlled Congress in the 115th to a Democrat-controlled Congress in the 116th. So the Democrats have 234 seats, and the magic number in the House is 218. That's the simple majority of the 435 total House votes. And so that means that Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer, when they're whip counting and trying to get votes to pass their bill, they can lose about 16 Democrats and still pass their legislation. So that's kind of their operating margin they have to work with. Over in the Senate stays in Republican hands, and actually they grew their majority by 2 seats, but the magic number here is, similar to the 218, is actually 60, and that means that the Democrats still have ability to hold back legislation from going forward by using essentially what's called the Filibuster Rule. Unless they invoke cloture and break a filibuster, the Democrats can block any legislation from coming to the floor, except for a reconciliation bill, which is a little bit more technical than we want to get into for this webinar. A big thing that I think people have seen in the headlines, this has been called the Year of the Woman. There's 101 women in the House now. About 23% of the House will now be women. And there will be 36 freshman women coming in, and we have a few firsts I think many people have seen. We have the first 2 Native American women elected to Congress and the first 2 Muslim women. We have 5 new medical professionals, 3 doctors, a dentist, and a nurse. Those are not women. These are just total members in that regard. Looking at the Senate, we have a total of 25 women in the Senate now. 4 are that are new. But mostly on the Democrat side, you see 17 Democratic women and 8 Republican women. Moving over to just the control of the House, one thing you'll quickly see is this is the blue is obviously Democratic held seats and red is Republican, and the dotted areas are meaning that it flipped. So these are congressional districts that if it's blue dotted, that means it was held by Republicans in the past, and now it's flipped to a Democratic controlling, and vice versa. If it's, you see, red dotted red areas, that means they used to be Democratic and now they're Republican. And you can see this is a classic bi-coastal map. This is what we see in the, from Washington State, Oregon, and California, heavily Democratic seats in these urban areas, and the same thing in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states. These tend to be very Democratic oriented, and that's where these population urban centers are. And you can see a cluster, well, of course, around Chicago. That's even though it looks kind of small, there's actually quite a few Democratic districts stacked up around that Chicagoland area of the tip of Lake Michigan. So the Senate control, this is again showing a flip of the dotted again means that the seats flip. So the Democrats picked up seats in New Mexico and Arizona, and then going eastward, Republicans picked up North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, and Florida seats. So that's where they picked up that net tube that you saw on that previous map. So in 2018, it was Democrats playing defense. They had every year of the 100 Senate seats, they were 6-year terms, and every year about a third of the Senate's up for re-election, but it's not evenly split between the parties, of course. So last go around, 2/3 of the seats that were up for election were held by Democrats, and you can see they lost 3 and picked up 2. So they were playing defense, and of course their map was they could have lost more seats. They held on, for instance, like the Manchin seat was on the bubble. And he held that seat in West Virginia. But voted. When you can see that some of the voting for our, Judge Kavanaugh happened right about that time, just before the election, and he voted for Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation. The opposite happens in 2 years from now. In 2020, you will see that now the Republicans will be on defense. So Mitch McConnell will be trying to protecting his Republican 21 seats up for re-election. I think roughly 5 of those were in states that Hillary carried. So those are the ones that we call on the priority list, so to speak, or the target list, and you'll see this reflected in voting that we have 2 years to go before the election, and Leader McConnell is going to be very careful about what kind of votes he lets occur. He's not going to want those, especially members who are on the bubble, to have to take so-called tough votes. So you'll see a lot of places where legislation is going to come flying over from the House. They have an aggressive agenda to move their policies forward. And, Mitch McConnell is the firewall between the president, but he's also the firewall to hold his Republican seats. He, of course, wants to hold his majority in 2020. So let me turn now to talk about the leadership on the 4 corners of as we call it, the Capitol. So in the Senate leadership, we have Mitch McConnell, of course, staying as leader. Thune picks up the majority whip job from Senator Cornyn, who is term limited out of that job. And then John Barrasso picks up the conference chairman. Moving over to the Democratic side, that's all stable, no change there, with Schumer and Durbin as the number 1 and 2, and Patty Murray as the number 3 position in the Senate. The House, of course, is the big change. Nancy Pelosi reclaims for the first or second time in history the speakers. I think Carl Albert was the other one, Tony. I'm learning to my seatmate here, Tony Mazzacci, who will be speaking next. And Steny Hoyer stays as leader, and Jim Clyburn as the whip, and Hakeem Jeffries picks up the job of the caucus chairman. Obviously Paul Ryan is retired, and that means that Kevin McCarthy moves up from, to the leader job. The number 1 Republican job is the minority, and Steve Scalise stays on as the second ranking Republican in the Republican conference, and the conference chairman is now Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney's daughter. Moving over to the Senate, this is drilling down onto the Appropriations Committee. Richard Shelby and Pat Leahy are chair and ranking. That's no change there. And then this next block down is going to be Roy Blunt and Patty Murray, who are the chair and ranking member, respectively, of the Labor, HHS, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee, which is one of the main subcommittees that the ASPPH advocates for programs across HRSA, NIH, ARC, and CDC. The authorizing committee for these programs for education and also for health are all consolidated into the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. No change there, with Lamar Alexander remaining as chair and Patty Murray as the ranking Democrat. So Patty Murray is both ranking on the authorizing committee and the appropriations committee for this jurisdiction of programs. Lamar Alexander has now indicated he is not going to run for re-election in 2020, so we're going to see a shift 2 years from now, regardless of who controls the Senate. Moving over to the House side, the counterparts on the Appropriations Committee, Nita Lowey, who was the ranking Democrat, steps up and grabs the gavel as the chair from Rodney Frelinghuysen, who retired. Kay Granger then steps up, who's next in line, and the Appropriations Committee seniority list to be the ranking Democrat from Texas. And Rosa DeLauro and Tom Cole switched places, Rosa picking up the gavel from Tom Cole. Last year, Cole was the chairman. Now Rosa will be the chair of the Labor, HHS, and Education Committee. She's been on this subcommittee for over 2 decades and knows the programs extremely well. And I think you'll see a pretty aggressive agenda from her. And she gets along very well with Tom Cole, as does Patty Murray and Roy Blunt. I should have mentioned these tend to be, even though they're partisans, when it comes to the Appropriations Committee, they do have to play out their different roles and represent their parties. But at a member level, working level, all of these members get along very well on the Appropriations Committee. Moving over to the authorizing committee for the education programs and labor, Bobby Scott will pick up the gavel of this committee, and Virginia Fox, will be the ranking Republican. So let me turn it over to Tony Buzzacci, who's the policy lead here at ASPPH. And Tony, want to pick up talk about Congress and Donald Trump?
Thought we'd discuss a little bit about the relationship between Congress and Donald Trump, especially going forward. In the first half of his term, which will hit the halfway mark next week, Donald Trump has not done much to try to build a coalition beyond his base. He's been much better at knocking off windows in the White House, as they say, rather than building a coalition to enact new legislation. And he's governed largely by fear. The Republicans have been fearful of primary challenges from Trump's base. The question is, now that the midterm election is over, will that fear factor continue to help drive congressional Republicans to support Trump, regardless of the substance of the matters? We're seeing some breaks in that already. I think Washington politicos were astounded last week with an op-ed that was posted by Mitt Romney, the incoming senator from Utah, that was a real slap at Trump and his character. And to do that before he even was sworn in was considered quite astounding. We're also seeing it on the funding crisis. For example, Vice President Pence was up on the Hill yesterday and again today, trying to shore up support because the Democratic strategy in the House of passing independent appropriations bills, there is some fear that a significant number of Republicans will vote for those bills, undercutting the president's perceived stature on the shutdown situation. History, if it's any guide, shows that during a split government, power generally flows to the executive branch and gives the executive branch much more power. And certainly that is how Trump was hoping it would play out. However, what we have seen so far is the firm and united opposition to anything Trump does, frankly, by the House Democrats has already come to the fore, given the dramatic television debate that was held on the border wall funding. It's not going to be easy for Trump to try to manage either the agenda or to hold a very limited minority in the House. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. And clearly the current fight over the border wall is really, in some ways, an effort to establish the relationship going forward. I mean, it is clearly both substantively important to many members, but it also will establish the terms of their engagement going forward. And I think that's why both sides are so entrenched, if not really all that interested in finding a compromise position. And that will, the other major issue is there have been a lot of mainstream Republicans who have supported Trump because he has been a terrific means to an end, especially for people from Wall Street and the Chamber of Commerce who have supported his moves on both taxes and deregulation. The question is, will they stick with Trump should we go into an economic downturn? And that is something I think we need to pay attention to as we see the economics play out. So let's turn now to the congressional agenda. You've heard lots of talk about the new House Democratic majority undertaking investigations and conducting oversight. Clearly, a lot of that will focus on the Mueller investigation, and the Mueller investigation overhangs everything that's going on in Washington. And it can break out at any time, and people are just waiting for the shoes to drop. And you hear constant rumors that, Mueller knows more and it's going to be devastating. And nobody really knows much, except Mueller. But there will be other hearings on health care, the administration's perceived efforts to sabotage enrollments in the Affordable Care Act, the pricing of ethical drugs. The pharmaceutical industry is going to be called up to the hill repeatedly on drug pricing issues. Climate change will be another major issue. The House has established a new select committee on climate change to bring focus to the issue. There'll be a lot of oversight hearings on EPA's regulatory efforts. We're quite interested in oversight on the student loan programs, both on the servicers as well as the management of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which has been ineptly managed to date. There'll be lots of hearings on immigration, issues about Facebook, big data, are the tech companies too large? There likely also will be hearings on diversity and sexual harassment. And so I think we will see a whole series of congressional hearings, many more hearings on oversight than we are likely to see on legislation going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tony. This is Mark. I'll pick it back up and talk a little bit about the funding that's facing us. There are some other challenges. So the underlying law that governs the appropriations process, we refer to that as discretionary spending. So that's about a third or so of the total budget. The total federal budget is somewhere around $4 trillion. And you can see the discretionary spending goes through the annual appropriations process. That's why they call it discretionary. And it's roughly half defense and half non-defense. And the underlying law that was passed back in 2011, when they had to raise the debt ceiling at the time, set forward a process that put in caps on spending for a decade. And we're still living with those statutory caps. So by law, Congress can't spend more than, in 2019, it turned out to be $1.244 trillion through the annual appropriations process. And that's those 12 appropriations bills that we were looking at earlier on the earlier slides. The underlying law requires that sequestration apply in the background. And so we have been living with that threat every year. The only time sequestration actually did occur from that 2011 law was FY 2013. And those of you may remember, there was roughly 5% cuts across the board to every federal agency's budget line items. After that, they started a series of 2-year budget deals. The first one was fiscal years applied to 14 and 15 that provided so-called relief against those caps. And that was what we called at the time Ryan Murray, for Senator Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, who then were the respective chairs of the Senate and House budget committees. So that raised the caps by, in avoiding cuts for that 2-year period, 14 and 15. And then the underlying caps, applied again for the next period, 16. So they did another 2-year deal for 16 and 17, and that was called Ryan Murray 2.0, very imaginative. By 18 and 19, Ryan was now speaker, and so no longer the budget committee chair. So we kind of got rid of the Ryan Murray. We didn't have a 3.0, but we did have another budget deal that applied to fiscal year 18 and 19 that, again, raised the caps above what was required by law. So we find ourselves now back in the position of, the underlying law applies. A new law will have to be passed and signed by the president to change that spending cap. And so if the 2-year deals are the new norm and there's nothing official about that, there's just been more of the policy, we would be looking to see the new Democratic Congress try to negotiate with their Senate counterparts in the White House, caps to avoid what is now facing us a $126 billion cut to the appropriations bills. And that falls into we have a firewall that still exists under the law between defense and non-defense. So the cut is about $71 billion of the 126 applies to defense. And for non-defense, it's about $55 billion. So that's roughly 5% cuts. That would be automatically happening. And that wouldn't be across the board. That would be the appropriators, if they stuck with those numbers, would have to go in. And, if it applied equally to different appropriations bills, the labor, HHS, and education bill, which we care about, would have to find roughly a 5% cut on a $180 billion bill, and that would mean billions of dollars of cuts to certain programs. And if you wanted to increase something else would have to be cut even more. So no one, I don't think, has the stomach to do that. So I'm expecting, my prediction would be that they would try to renegotiate new caps. And I think there's Republican support for certainly not cutting defense by $71 billion. I can almost guarantee you that. And usually the Democrats argue if you're going to have increases for defense, we want so-called parity for non-defense. And that is something that we would look to see. So where do the deficits come from? Well, here's a nice chart that kind of shows you, in 2018 at least, you can see these are some of the elements of, defense, disaster aid, other legislation that adds to the growing deficit. And this is, the deficit's an annual difference between the revenues that the Congress takes or the Treasury takes in through taxes, personal and corporate, and user fees, and what they spend in mandatory programs and then Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the appropriations process. So you can see this has been climbing steadily from 15 up through 19. The last year, the budget was actually balanced, so-called, where there was no deficit. There was actually running a surplus. Was right at the end of the Clinton administration. So that was in 2000. Ever since then, we returned to annual deficit spending. And of course, if every year you add up these blocks of spending, you're adding to the debt, the overall debt. It goes up every year. So right now we have a debt that is reaching $21 trillion, and a debt ceiling hike is going to be needed. And we're hearing the Democrats may adopt the so-called Gephardt Rule. That means if you adopt a budget resolution, you're automatically raising the debt ceiling, so you're not having a separate vote. The last time we raised the debt ceiling is when we had that sequestration process that kind of kicked in when I'm getting too much into details, but there was a super committee that was supposed to find entitlement savings and never did. And so we have this underlying sequestration law that was enacted. So, you can see that's going to be the headline, and it's not clear now the Republicans are the minority, no longer have responsibility for producing budgets or appropriations bills. Are they going to be helping, raise debt, spending caps and dealing with the debt ceiling, or are they going to, vote against everything and make Nancy Pelosi deliver the votes? I think that's going to be an open book for a while. We're going to see how they're going to position themselves. Of course, when you're in the minority, your goal is to take back the majority. So I'm sure they're already thinking about what's in the Republican House caucus strategy for, are they going to be cooperative and support increases in spending, which is going to continue to add debt, or are they going to, kind of just oppose everything? So I think we'll see that play out in the next few months. So this next slide gets into a little bit of the share of the spending growth. Where did this come from exactly? So you can see it's largely entitlements. There is growth. You can see the blue and the red. The non-defense discretionary is what NDD stands for. So that's the domestic appropriations bills. The red is the defense appropriations bills. And so that increase relative to the current laws, when I refer to this increase in the caps, the spending caps, that's what that represents on this pie chart on the left. And you can see under it is largely entitlements, so healthcare is going to be the Medicare, Medicaid, S-chip programs. Social Security, of course, it grows by, COLA adjustments and population. Interest on the debt, you can see that is a dramatic increase going from 7% to 19% on the next slide. And that's very sensitive to interest rates that are paid. So if the Fed hikes interest rates up for Treasury bills, that means that we're spending more when we go into the markets every month, and as our Treasury bills roll over and have to go to auction on a monthly basis. If you have to pay higher interest on the 21 trillion, whatever's coming due that month, is a cohort of that total portfolio, that can explode. And I've seen estimates that in 3 or 4 years, the interest on the debt could be larger than the entire defense budget, over $600 billion, which is pretty scary. So it's in the interest of the federal government. The interest rates stay low, but also means that people put money into savings accounts don't get much ROI. So earmarks, this is something that was a feature of appropriations bills when the Democrats last held the Congress, and when the Republicans took over in the Tea Party wave of 2010, they banned earmarks. And so we've been now going 8 years without having appropriations bills have earmarks. What are earmarks? Well, they're within an appropriations bill, within an appropriation account, say Health Resources and Services Administration, a member of Congress can ask $500,000, $1 million be earmarked for a particular hospital, for a university, for construction, for bricks and mortar, for programs. And so the appropriations bills used to have quite a few of these. To give you for the labor HHS and education bill at the time had about 1% of the total earmarked for projects, around somewhere right around $1 billion, a little over $1 billion of projects. And so hundreds of projects were there. Now, this is something that the House Democrats said that they wanted to bring back. And so the letter that you see on this screen is from Nita Lowey, who's the incoming chair on the House Appropriations Committee, says that we're interested in bringing this back. I've heard myself from Leader Hoyer, Steny Hoyer, that they were going to try to bring back earmarks. For them to do that politically is going to be sensitive. They're going to have Republican support, otherwise they'll be criticized for it. So it's either I think everyone's in or no one's in. It's going to be the House and Senate both have to agree to them on the bipartisan, bicameral basis. And of course, the president has to sign these bills. He would have to also be willing to sign appropriations bills that contain earmarks. So I think it's not yet a done deal. It's something that we have kind of on our watch list. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tony.
So now we thought we'd discuss a couple of other issues outside of the funding realm. And first and foremost, of course, is immigration, which dominated the last Congress and will continue to be a major topic of conversation and debate going forward. The travel ban that was instituted by the Trump administration on his very first day in office was eventually changed quite a bit, but then ended up in the Supreme Court. We filed 3 friend of the court amicus briefs opposing the travel ban. However, the court upheld it. We're all you're fully aware of the border wall controversy. The administration said it would end the DACA program. That has been held up by 3 or 4 different federal district courts. That's expected to be decided eventually by the U.S. Supreme Court. You're fully aware of the full family separation policy. There's been a limit on Chinese students in certain STEM fields. They have instituted all kinds of administrative hurdles on students who are already in the United States. But one that has not gotten much attention is a proposal by the Department of Homeland Security to trim back the optional practical training extension for individuals from foreign countries training in designated STEM fields in the United States. This affects students who have F1 and M1 visas. The Department of Homeland Security said that it will propose new rules governing these extensions in the months ahead. Right now, everyone gets an automatic 1-year OPT extension, but if you are in designated STEM fields, you get an additional 2 years. Several of the public health disciplines are considered designated STEM fields, but not all of them. So it depends on how your major and degree is classified. but it will affect a significant number of people at schools and programs of public health. This is still subject to the comment and review period of the Administrative Procedures Act, so it's unlikely to take effect for 18 months or more once it's issued, but we are expecting to see it sometime this spring, and that's one that we will need to be aware of. Cumulative impact of all of these debates, however, have clearly made the United States a less than welcoming place for foreign scholars and students. We are seeing a drop in international students coming into the United States. The students from China are dropping precipitously, and they are by far the largest cohort of foreign students in the U.S. Whereas we are seeing huge increases in the number of foreign students going to Canada and to England. And reestablishing the United States as a welcoming place for foreign students and scholars will not be easy even after Trump's term is over. So it's a major issue. The Higher Education Act has not been reauthorized for more than a decade. The Republicans in the House did pass out a reauthorization bill a year ago. It did not make it to the House floor because it did not have adequate support. That law, the bill that they approved by committee would have abolished the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, made numerous other changes in student loan programs. The Democrats introduced their own bill, which would have kept the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and kept the generous terms for the income-based repayment plans. There has been some question about whether Chairman Scott on the House side and Lamar Alexander on the Senate side would make a push for a new version of the Higher Education Act going forward. Some people think it was more likely. However, Lamar Alexander, in many of his conversations about his agenda going forward, given that this is going to be his last couple of years in office, he has not mentioned the Higher Education Act reauthorization as being a priority at all. And partly people think that's because of the Title IX controversy. The Department of Education has issued proposed new rules governing Title IX, which, as you know, is the law that mandates university investigational procedures on sexual harassment and assault claims on campus. Those rules are very controversial, and frankly, I don't think there are very many people in Congress that want to take up the issue. So I do not believe we will see a Higher Education Act reauthorization, certainly not this year, and I would be doubtful that we would see a full-blown reauthorization bill in 2020. We may see a piecemeal approach, but I don't believe this is going to be a major issue of controversy. Mm-hmm. So I'll turn it back to Mark.
Thanks, Tony. Let me talk a little bit about getting public health on the congressional agenda. So when you get to a new Congress, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of optimism, and a lot of interest in doing new things and taking on new initiatives. The Congresses last for 2 years, so we have, this is year 1 of 2, and usually the first year is sometimes often called the legislating year because you're not getting caught up in tough votes on the year when folks are running for election. So we'll see what happens, but there's been a few proposals already put forward. This one, commend you to take a look at it. It's easy to find online from the Public Health Leadership Forum. The primary authors are Jeff Levy out at GW University and Karen DeSalvo put together a thoughtful piece about public health infrastructure. And when we were talking a lot about the appropriations process, and this paper proposes kind of investing across the public health agencies in what they call core infrastructure programs and doing it on the mandatory side. So that would be coming out of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House and the Health Committee in the Senate. And to give you some kind of precedent for this, as part of the Affordable Care Act, Title IV established the Prevention and Public Health Fund. So that was mandatory money that kind of rolled into the appropriations process and supplemented programs at CDC and elsewhere in the public health service. So that's kind of what this paper is about. It's put out there as a thought piece and see if it gets any traction on the Hill with the authorizers. But it's a good read. It's the idea that, public health is infrastructure is underfunded, and it makes a very cogent case for that and puts forward a proposal similar to that, but going back to the appropriations process. Some of the traditional groups in town, ASTO, Association of State Rural Health Officials, of course, ASPPH has been involved in this process. NACHO, county and city health officials, Trust for America's Health, American Public Health Association, APHA, others are interested in kind of, we were watching, what has been happening with NIH, which over the last 4 years saw budget increases of roughly $2 to $3 billion a year, and they've gone from $30 billion for NIH to $39 billion over 4 years. And not much has happened in the CDC, HRSA, SAMHSA space at the same time. This is focused really at CDC, and the purpose of at least the branding here is to increase the CDC budget 22% by the year 2022. So if we assume the CDC base for 19 is roughly $7 billion, they want to add $500 million a year over the next 3 years. That's it, kind of in a nutshell. So we'll see if that gets some traction with the Appropriations Committee. We have been talking to some of the folks on the Appropriations Committee, and there's obviously new leadership in the House, and it's going to compete with everything else in that bill. And I used to be on this subcommittee in the staff years ago, and Nancy Pelosi was on this subcommittee, and she deemed it a lamb eat lamb, not dog eat dog subcommittee, because everything's attractive and something that Democrats want to support at least, and many Republicans as well. So it's tough competition in that bill because there's a lot of meritorious labor programs, HHS programs, education programs, and others, and it's tough. So you have to make your case, and that's what these papers intend to do. So let me turn it back to Tony.
One other issue that we're trying to make an effort to get public health on the agenda is through the opioid litigation. As you may know, more than 400 state, local, territorial, and tribal governments have sued the manufacturers of opioid drugs, as well as some of the distributors and others, in an effort to recoup costs for dealing with the crisis at their local government level. We have a task force that is beginning to work to try to come up with a list of potential public health interventions that might be part of a master settlement agreement on the opioid litigation. Their report is due later this spring, which will go to the court, which is in Ohio, which is managing all of the litigation. This is really taking a page out of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement strategy, which was the subject of an article by Dr. Cheryl Healton, the dean at NYU, early last fall. And I think it's worth reading as a potential strategy of trying to get support for public health from the manufacturers of the opioid drugs and manufacturers of the opioid crisis. So I would like to turn now to what you can do to advance policy and advocacy in the public health field. And first and foremost, do what you're doing right now, and that's staying informed and educated. We have resources, as Dr. Erickson said, on the ASPPH home site, website. If you go to Connect and then Advocacy Fact Sheets, you'll see talking points, detailed policy papers, a whole host of materials, as well as an activities list that lists about 200 or so different initiatives that we have taken in the last 12 months with links to the original source documents on a whole range of topics. One of the great things about public health is that it touches so many different policies and legislative initiatives. And that also is a challenge for us, is to establish priorities and staying on top of this broad agenda. We also made an effort in the fall to promote voter registration and voting by our schools, and we do have some anecdotal evidence that our students and faculty turned out in great numbers last year. And so maintaining that momentum of being a participant in the process is critically important. You should also feel free to call, write, and meet with your elected representatives whenever you have a point of view that you want to share. And in fact, it's good to connect with them even when you don't have a point of view, so that when something comes up, you've established a relationship. On our webpage are talking points on many of the key issues you might have an interest in advocating on. But I think it's even more important that you tell your story and tell how federal funding and federal policies are affecting either your mission work or issues you care a great deal about. I would also urge you to think locally and regionally. We've been talking today almost exclusively about federal legislation, but it is a lot easier sometimes to get involved on local and state and regional issues, and those policymakers often move on to federal positions. So don't feel intimidated by the federal policy game. Feel free to reach out to your local and state and regional policymakers as well. We have a number of resources available to help you do that. We have a partnership with the Congressional Management Foundation and have sponsored a series of advocacy webinars on how to advocate, how to be a good champion for your cause. On their webpage is a guide for setting up and conducting face-to-face meetings with congressional staff, personal office staff, committee staff, and the members themselves. But I would also urge you to, again, keep it local. While all members of Congress have DC offices, they also all have congressional offices. And you should feel free to reach out to those local offices, make contacts. Let them know that you are a resource if they have questions on some of the topics that you have expertise on. Because frankly, they're always looking for experts and suggestions about possible witnesses for oversight hearings. Establishing a relationship is the first step in being a successful advocate. And again, as I said, you can advocate, educate, and be a resource. If you're a faculty member, perhaps your research findings would be of interest as a way to establish a relationship with a congressional office. And also feel free to share those with state and local policymakers as well. So at that point, I believe we'll stop and turn it back over to Dr. Erickson.
Thank you, Tony and Mark. That was excellent, informative, and right on time. And now's a chance to ask questions. You can go to the chat box. The instructions are on the page now, and to put in any questions you may have for other presenters. Let me, while people are doing that, let me make a comment and then ask a question myself. One of the points I think was important with our session was the role that academic public health can play in advocacy. And just to emphasize the importance of the research that we do, conducting the research and then disseminating it and making it visible to help with policy making and decision making. And as a perfect example of that, the New England Journal article that Tony showcased from Cheryl Hilton at NYU about reviewing the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement and its implications for other public health problems, particularly opioid, really helps advance the policy agenda by getting the expertise that exists in schools and programs and their experience that they've had and putting that forward in the public forum for ideas about how we can do things better than in the past, and also to increase the investment in the public good. So, both conducting the scholarship as well as disseminating it and teeing it up and sharing it with policy and decision makers at all levels is something I think that we're uniquely able to do to help advance a policy and advocacy agenda. My question then for Mark and Tony is that I was doing the math in my head when you were looking at the gender balance in the House and the Senate, And it seemed like for both of them, about a quarter of the members are women, which is great insofar as it's an increase from what it was in the past, but it's still shortfall for what it should be, which obviously should be half at least. I think we're making progress there, but not where we need to be. So, but my question is, if we were to look at that data around racial and ethnic comparisons, what would we see? With gender, we're about halfway there, quarter representation, but I'm kind of pessimistic that if we were to look at gender or race and ethnicity and House and Senate membership, it would not even be that positive.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dr. Erickson. I mean, it was interesting, however, to look at the first day of Congress. On the Democratic side, you did see a tremendous amount of diversity. It is making tremendous progress, I think, on the Democratic side. You're not seeing much progress on the Republican side, however. One commentator said that the Democratic side looked very much like America, and the Republican side looked like a 1955 meeting of the Duluth Chamber of Commerce. And I was struck because minutes after he said that, the Republicans on the Senate side announced that they were appointing 2 women to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And those are the very first Republican women to ever serve on the Judiciary Committee in the history of this country, which I think goes to your point of showing that we have an awful long way to go in having representation that really does reflect the country. It will be very slow coming to the Senate. I think we have seen tremendous progress in the House.
Yes, Mark, I would agree with that, Tony. I think you have to really look at the Congress in 4 segments, House and Senate, R's and D's. And if you look at those, I think the number of members of the Black Caucus now in the House is at an all-time high, I think around 55. And if you take the denominator as 235 for Democratic caucus, you're looking at about 23% African American in the Democratic caucus of the House versus, the general population, which I think is around 18%. So overrepresented, in the Democratic caucus a little bit, but not in the whole House, of course, because the denominator is 435. Hispanics are also coming up higher in the House and the Democratic caucus this year than they have in the past. But again, I think that what you're going to see is slow to changes. The Republican conference, I don't think you'll see those kinds of numbers reflected anytime soon in the House, and then certainly the Senate. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, I would also mention, the House passed a whole set of Democratic rule changes. And one of the things that the Democrats did is they created a new Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
That's right.
And that's the very first time. And the charge of that office is to come up with statistics on not just the members, but of the staff. Because I will say, I think there is a major diversity issue on the staff as well. When you walk around the halls of Congress, you don't see as many African American or Hispanic staff members as I think you have every right to see.
That's right.
So it's not just members, it's staff as well.
Right. And there are some outside groups that are put a spotlight on this and are racking and kind of grading, especially Senate offices, and they look at the chief of staff and the legislative director. How many minorities do you have in those offices? And they are kind of scorecarding them, so to speak. And I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
So do we have any questions from participants?
We don't have any that have come in. We would urge everyone to submit questions using the comment box online. We have the slide up showing you where to enter it. Give you a few more minutes.
Yeah, Mark, let me ask another question. When you were talking about the deficit and that it's approaching $1 trillion, what percent of the overall federal budget is that?
Well, the budget's roughly $4 trillion. So we're running $1 trillion. That means our revenue is $3 trillion and our spending is $4 trillion. So, roughly, somewhere around 30%, I guess, as the math. So we have a long way to go to climb out of that hole. The tricky part is, do you raise taxes, to close that loop? We just cut taxes last December, a year ago, that blew $1 trillion hole in the 10-year projection. That was not paid for or offset, as we say. So that's catching up to us. That $1 trillion is spread. So it's not $1 trillion, evenly, but it's ramping up actually. So the first year, I can't remember exactly the number, but let's say at $50 billion. I think it's going to grow more. So some of that you're seeing reflected is just that implementation. It's $1 trillion gap spread over a 10-year period. It kind of peaks in the middle and then kind of phases out. Some of these things do expire. Some of them are not permanent. Some are. So, that's kind of the gap. It's going to be challenging to close that gap if you're not going to take on entitlements and you're not going to raise revenue. I mean, that's been the classic problem we've been stuck on for a decade here in Washington.
And the talking point that, you can cut waste and fraud and abuse and administrative overhead. You can probably cut some, but it's not going to make much of a difference with these astronomical debt numbers.
Right. I mean, what you see reflected in the Trump budgets, he's submitted, 2 so far. He's about to submit a third one with Mick Mulvaney as the OMB director. And that's why you see these wholesale eliminations of they want to close a $55 billion gap on non-defense spending by not raising the cap by that amount. And that's why you see complete elimination of it's community development block grants, $3 billion, elimination of ARC, the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality, with pretending to fold it into NIH, which they really don't, elimination of NIOSH, the same thing.
20% cut in the NIH budget, which was a political non-starter.
Right, yeah, $7 billion cut to NIH when we're going the opposite direction. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that you would have to do on the discretionary side, meaning you're running that through the appropriations process, and they just don't have the stomach to do it. I mean, we've seen a Republican Congress and the House and Senate reject that 2 years in a row, and now you have Democrats in the House controlling it. They're going to reject that, but that is what they're going to propose in February. So I mean, the point, to his credit, Paul Ryan put his toe in the water to try to talk about cutting entitlements or getting them under control. He got no support, from certainly within his own conference. He had what we call the Freedom Caucus members of about 30 Republicans that are willing to take that pain. They're in very safe congressional districts. The rest of the conference did not have the stomach to want to go there. They even get a budget resolution on the House floor to reflect that. And the Senate, that was just not as Tony said, it's a non-starter.
And, Congress constantly, appoints another blue ribbon committee to try to come up with some process restrictions that will solve the problem when the process really isn't the problem. It's the lack of political will.
Right. And so when you really get into the economics of it, people start talking about, what is the deficit? What is the debt as a percent of GDP for our country versus other countries? And, how much is our currency worth in a global market? So you get into kind of the economist debate pretty quickly. And, that's kind of where if you're really going to try to solve it, they don't want the federal spending as a percent of GDP or to be more than 20%. And that's what led to this architecture of the sequestration. That what was behind that was actually some real economic math and calculations to kind of keep us under those parameters. But I think that's not been discussed in years now.
Great, thank you. As we approach the end, any last comments from Tony or Mark?
Yeah, we did get a question that came in asking, how does ASPPH work with federal agencies such as CDC or HRSA to advocate for funding, given the intense competition for funds by all special interest groups? I would say, we have conversations with the agency staff all of the time. The trouble currently is that the agency staff is not consulted necessarily by the administration when it puts its budget together. And so, for example, right now, no one at CDC, HRSA, or NIH has yet to see the administration's budget proposal for 2020, which theoretically is scheduled to be delivered to Congress the first week of February. And so while we talk to the agency personnel, they're not policymakers here on the budget issues. Once the appropriation gets set, then, obviously they have a key role in implementing those decisions.
That's right. And the agencies are bound to, the limits of what the president proposes to the Congress. So they have to, they're not advocates for increasing beyond what the president's asked for. They can't be in that role, but they can provide technical assistance, to the Congress, to outside groups. If you were to get an extra X million dollars, how would it be best spent? Sometimes the question comes in the form of what would be a professional judgment budget. So groups, there are actually some agencies do have in their statute a bypass budget. So the National Cancer Institute, for instance, has a bypass budget. So even though they have to propose to the Congress the budget cut that's coming out of OMB, they do, at least for NCI, have the ability to send to Congress, here's what we think we really need. It might be 5 or 10% increase, and here's how we would spend it. The Office of AIDS Research has something like that, and NIH as well. Most agencies do not, but sometimes members of Congress will ask them during the hearing process, what could you do with an extra $10 million or $20 million? And agencies can answer those questions if they're asked specifically and render some sort of a judgment as to how money can be best spent. And we do have those sort of dialogues.
Yes, absolutely. And the data that the agencies have and are forced by law to publicly disclose does help our advocacy cause a great deal. For example, as Mark said, we get the question, if we gave X amount of extra money, for example, the Prevention Research Center program, how many more centers could be funded? How much more work could be accomplished? Right. And how many more people could be touched?
Right. And a lot of advocacy is simply explaining the agency's mission. So we can just, without asking for money or new dollars, just say, here's what this agency does. And then it kind of can lead naturally to, do they need more money to do that mission? And you can answer that honestly and fairly. So.
And just to finish up on that is that Tony and Mark and the ASPPH leadership met with CDC director last month to hear about their priorities and where they'd like to go with resources to help inform our advocacy efforts. So as the time is up, information's on your screen about accessing the webinar, the PowerPoint, and the dialogue. I want to thank Mark and Tony for all their hard work in putting this together, and wish all of our participants a happy and productive new year, and encourage you to get to know your congressional district staff as your assignment. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you at our annual meeting in March.